Hi everybody, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about core game loops. This is something that's absolutely fundamental to game development. I'm incredibly embarrassed that I've had this channel for more than a year and I've never talked about this. And I bring that up because it's so fundamental I don't even think about it. I've mentioned this a few times about other things that it doesn't occur to me to talk about certain things because it's just so like endemic to the process, and I've been doing it for so long. It doesn't even occur to me that this is something I should mention. But I was looking at something online and they were talking about core game loops, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I have not even mentioned core game loops. So let's talk about this, because this is a core game loop. If you're a designer, you're going to be thinking in terms of this. You're going to be writing it up almost immediately when you make a game. If you're a programmer, unless you're a specialist, like a network programmer or maybe just doing UI, you're going to spend much of your time on core game loop code. So let's talk about it. What is the core game loop? The core game loop is the set of actions in a game that most players will spend most of their time doing. You can think of it as, what are the most frequent and repeated actions that players take in your game? I'm going to talk about how these are identified and why you need to identify it, because, like I said, I should have done this as the first video I ever made. Some games, it's very easy to determine the core game loop. Most side-scrollers, especially the really simple side-scrollers, their core game loop is very easy to describe. You run to the right, jumping and shooting to progress through the level, to grab treasure, and to kill enemies. By the way, when you finish the level, your bonus is based on how long it took you to do it. There's the core game loop. Now, RPGs can be a lot more complex than that, obviously, because there's a lot more actions that players can take, and defining what the typical player is can be really hard. So let's pop up for a second and just talk about, let's say we're talking about fantasy games. Fantasy games can have massively different core game loops. And now notice I didn't say RPGs. I just mean like two fantasy games. The core game loops can be wildly different. Some fantasy games, their core game loop may be entirely focused on combat. The whole point of it. Maybe it's a fantasy tactical combat game. Everything about their core game loop is combat. It is selecting the units you want to have in that combat. It is doing the combat, selecting the individual actions that each unit takes in combat. Everything about this is combat. But you might have another fantasy RPG, or fantasy game, I should say, where it's all about exploration. A lot of games have come out that are like this, where you're really just exploring a world. You're not really fighting. You're not really even talking to anything. You're just running around the world. Maybe it's just to have fun and explore. Maybe there's a story being told visually, but it's the exploration that's important. And then again, you may make a fantasy game, where most of the action is really conversation. There's a story, but it unfolds as you talk to NPCs, as you read books, as you look at computer terminals. These are narrative games that are telling their story primarily through a narrative. They maybe some of them have exploration components. Maybe they're linear and there isn't an exploration component. The reason I wanted to bring that up is you can see that just saying fantasy game doesn't tell you what the core game loop. They can be wildly different in all these games. Now, on my games, it's even harder because the core game loop depends on the player's build. I may make a game where I expect all the players may have to do combat occasionally. Some players will do it a lot. All players have to do dialogue occasionally. Some players may do it a lot. All the players have to do stealth occasionally. Some players will do it a lot. And because these characters can be mutually exclusive, there is no one action in the core game loop that I can say all the players do. But when you group all them together, you can say most players will do most of these most of the time. Now, if you're trying to learn what a core game loop is, I can tell you, you don't have to play an entire game from start to finish to know what its core game loop is. Usually you can pick up a game, play it for an hour, and you can probably pretty accurately define its core game loop. If it's a good game. And this is why some games fail, I think, is because they don't have a well-defined core game loop, and you can play for an hour and you're like, I still don't know what's going on. Alternatively, you could just play a demo. The whole point of a demo is to express the core game loop. And by the way, if you're making a vertical slice, you should also be thinking core game loop, because that's what you're trying to express. Not just here's a visual example of the game, but I've got enough of the core game loop in there that you understand what the game's going to be like when you play it. It's not enough vertical slices. It's not enough for them just to be pretty. They have to instantiate the core game loop. A lot of times I've noticed that if you just watch a streamer play the game, that's enough for you to figure out the core game loop. Just watch them for an hour and you'll see what they're doing over and over and over again. Are they jumping? Are they sneaking around? Are they hacking terminals? What seems to be the thing that they do the most? That's the core game loop. Let me make a big distinguish here between core game loops and design pillars. I have a whole video on design pillars and I'll link it below. They are not the same thing. The design pillars are there to explain how every feature that you've selected to be in the game serves those pillars. But a core game loop is you saying, okay, of all those features that we've put in the game that serve the design pillars, these are the ones I expect most of the players to experience most of the time. And there's difference there because you may have things that you put in, like let's say you put in reactivity. That's something I love putting in my games. Reactivity might be a design pillar, which means when you put in features, you're going to always ask the question of how does what the player does when they interact with this feature come back to them? How are they being told, hey, here's how good you're doing with this thing? The core game loop would be those features that the player does a lot. You would expect all of them to have large amounts of reactivity, because if this is what the player is doing most of the time, it better be supporting that design pillar of reactivity. Because I've talked about you can occasionally have a feature that doesn't support all the design pillars. Like you may put something in that if humor is one of your design pillars, you may have something in the game that's not that funny as long as overall the game is funny. But for your core game loop, it should probably touch on all your pillars because these features are what the player's doing a lot. It should have a basis in those design pillars. So at this point, you should probably know why you want to define this, but let's dive into that. Your core game loop tells your entire team what to focus on, because here are the features of this big design document. Here are the features that are the most important to get correct, to get in early, to get them correct. It will help you. It'll help the production staff decide what to prioritize, because when there are features that have to be done, you're like, well, these are part of the core game loop. They have to be done. You could have a fun, it's like side quests. If you have to drop a side quest because you run out of time, that's okay because it's not part of the main story. Your features help you schedule in the same way. This is a great feature. It's fun, but is it part of the core game loop? And if it's not, it can go. You may not want it to go, but it can go. Similarly, when you get to the end of the game, this tells you where to spend a lot of your time optimizing. Because if core game loop features, like I said, it's where most players spend most of their time. You want that to be optimized. You want a smooth UI experience. You want a good frame rate. You want to make sure that there are no bugs in that core game loop, because that's what most of your players are going to spend most of their time doing. If there's an occasional bug that occurs from some obscure thing that the player can maybe do, like maybe if they craft one item at a particular table and give it to a particular NPC and it causes that NPC to go in a bad state, you want to fix that. But if you had to prioritize that bug against oh yeah, if you ever shoot a gun at an NPC that has more than 5 hit points, sometimes the game crashes. Fix that. So, another reason you want to make your core game loops, you want to define it as early as you can in your design docs, is publishers will want to see them. They frequently ask to see them, and it's what the publisher will judge all of your game content against. If they see you saying your core game loop is this, and then your game seems to be filled with a bunch of features and content that aren't part of the core game loop, they're going to ask you why it's there. But, and I'll tell you this, there's another reason for you to make sure the core game loop is defined early, because you want publishers or whoever's giving you money to see that core game loop. It is a great way to provide context for answers to your questions when they have questions about it. So if, for example, you have a publisher going, well, we really like microtransactions. A great way to respond to that if you don't want them is like, we don't see a role for microtransactions in this game's core game loop. And the reason that's a nice way of phrasing it is either they have to figure out how microtransactions would fit in that core game loop, which they're probably not going to be able to do, or they're going to have to ask you to change the core game loop, which your response would be, that's the core game loop. So you want me to change the entire game. So we're going to throw away this, we're going to throw away these things, because if microtransactions are part of the core game loop, we're going to redesign. It is a nice defense against some of the things that publishers will ask you to add. But because if it's not part of the core game loop, you're like, I don't see a lot of players doing this, and I certainly don't see a lot of players doing this a lot. You can often get features, suggested features, either deprioritized or not considered altogether. One last thing about core game loop, and I'm saying this from experience. The bigger your core game loop, the longer it takes you to write it down, the more features that are part of it, the harder that game loop will be to implement. I say this from experience because when I make games that I say I want people to be able to play them all these different ways, I want them to talk through it and fight through it and stealth through it and go through primarily with companion support. That just added a lot of work and time to your schedule. Because if that's the core game loop that you expect most of the players to be doing, it's got to be good. And of course, like I've always said, that then translates to a big core game loop will translate into a big schedule, which will translate into a big team and a lot of money. So it's in your best interest to try to get your core game loop as laser focused as possible, but understand that some games will have big core game loops. It's just always in your best interest. It's in your best interest. It's in your team's best interest for knowing what they should work on. And it's in the publisher's best interest for knowing what game they're buying and how you're going to respond to suggestions to change it. It's in everybody's best interest to get that core game loop defined as early and as specifically as you can. I hope this helps.